Hello, everyone. Welcome to the seminar at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation on the role of Alexei Navalny. We have two very distinguished guests who also are, in fact, old friends of mine. And to discuss this topic, Maria Snegovaya is a postdoctoral fellow at Virginia Tech, a visiting scholar at the Institute of Eurasian and Russian Studies at George Washington University, and a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. She is her academic specialty is democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe and including Russia. So she's certainly very well qualified to talk about the topic at hand today. Brian Whitmore is a longtime observer of Russian politics. He is the host of the Power Vertical blog, which was really one of the outstanding features of Radio Liberty for many years, and in fact, I also participated in it. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Texas in Arlington, and is affiliated as a fellow with the Atlantic Council here in Washington. So let me welcome both of our panelists, and I think that perhaps, Brian, we can begin with you. And the first question that I'd like to pose is Alexei Navalny a suitable leader of the democratic movement in Russia? Circumstances have created a situation in which he has become identified with the Russian opposition. Boris Nemtsov, as we know, was murdered. Other prominent opposition leaders capable of summoning a crowd and mobilizing people for protest are not visible, at least at the moment. How can we assess Navalny as a potential leader of the opposition and indeed of the country?
That's a good question, David. I mean, unfortunately, we don't get to choose who our opposition leaders are. I mean, think back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Imagine if Andrei Sakharov had lived, and if Andrei Sakharov had been the first post-Soviet leader, right? So Navalny is the opposition leader we got right now. And there are positive and negative things associated with this. But I think right now, I mean, I think what we need to do when we're thinking about Navalny is separate Navalny the man from the phenomenon that Navalny has created. Just this is the topic of this discussion, the Navalny phenomenon. And this phenomenon is, in my opinion, what Russia needs, regardless of what we may think of Alexei Navalny the man. The Navalny phenomenon matters because it is creating a horizontally integrated network across Russia's 11 time zones. This is a new thing. It's a integrated, I mean, if Putin has the power vertical, Navalny has created the power horizontal. This horizontally integrated civic network that is independent of the state. And that, I believe, is unprecedented in Russia at this scale. So I think that's really important. And Navalny did that and deserves credit for that, regardless of the of other objections we may have to things like the nationalism in his past and other things. Another thing is he's encouraging Russians to think of themselves as citizens, not as subjects. This really struck me back in 2013 when Navalny was briefly sent to prison for the first time and then was released. And when he returned triumphantly to Yaroslavsky Vokzal in Moscow, and he gave a stirring speech there. And one of the people in the crowd shouted out at one point, "Мы граждане," we are citizens. And at that moment, I said, okay, he's instilling this sense of citizenship in the Russian people, in his followers, and that's important. The first step in Russia changing is Russians themselves thinking of themselves as citizens and not as subjects. Third, his focus on corruption is really hitting the regime's weak spot. It really is. This is where the regime is weak, and Navalny's laser-like focus on this has been very effective. And he's a very effective communicator at this. One of the problems in the past with the Russian opposition is they're not always the best communicators. Navalny is an outstanding communicator. As somebody who used to work in media, I can say that for sure. And then his appeal, he appeals to the urban intellectuals and professionals, but he also appeals to the working class. And he has recently begun reaching out and making alliances with labor unions, which I find extremely interesting. And one has to wonder if the Putin regime is not going to at some point fall victim to the populist wave that has swept the West in recent years. So this is another thing that Navalny's done that other opposition leaders have not done in the past. And I'm sure, as Maria can get into, he pretty much owns the young generation. He pretty much owns the post-Soviet generations, plural. And then that's effectively Russia's future. Now, of course, we got questions going forward. Can the Navalny network, can this power horizontal that Alexei Navalny has created, can it survive without Navalny if the Kremlin decides to keep him in prison, which it appears it is going to do? Can this network, can the Navalny phenomenon survive and thrive without Navalny himself? I think it may. The other thing is this thorny question of Navalny's nationalism. It was in the news recently. With Amnesty revoking his prisoner of conscience status, I think unfairly and incorrectly. But the question here is, there's no doubt that Navalny has a nationalist past. I don't know what's in his heart, if he's just figured it's better PR to tone it down, or if he's genuinely changed and grown. But the question for me is, can this nationalism be transformed into a kind of positive form of civic patriotism? To get out of the ethnic nationalism category and into this sense of civic patriotism. I think that is a key question going forward. And should Navalny ever come to power? And I would add that no Russian figure has come to power from outside the elite since Vladimir Lenin in 1917. Everything else has been an inside job one way or the other. And so if Navalny did that, it'd be the first time in a century. But if he did that, could he truly uproot corruption? Because uprooting and corruption in Russia isn't just uprooting something that's a bug in the system. Corruption in Russia is a feature. It's a part of the system. It's the glue that holds the system together. And the political scientist Elena Ledeneva has written eloquently about this, about how ingrained these kind of corrupt networks of influence are. And could any Russian leader overcome this? Navalny's whole legitimacy is based on fighting corruption. And the final thing is, I got questions on his views on foreign affairs. There's an old saying that Russian liberalism stops at the Ukrainian border. And I suspect this would be the case with Navalny as well, given his previous statements on Crimea. So before the West falls in love with him, in this case, I think we have to be aware that he could also potentially be a very formidable geopolitical opponent. And I'll stop with that, but I'd be glad to kind of later in the discussion elaborate on any of the points I made.
Well, thank you, Brian. Maria, do you want to respond to Brian's remarks?
Yeah, thank you very much, David, for having me, and Brian for making excellent remarks in this regard. I would also say that the question, of appropriateness, after all, I think it's up to people, the Russian people, to decide who is, from their viewpoint, is the most appropriate leader. And as of now, Navalny, I think, in their eyes, have proven himself to be really the most committed and incredibly capable and talented Russian politicians. So just two achievements, I'm sure that of Navalny that stand out. Certainly all of us right know this constant struggle of Russian liberals to counter the Kremlin one way or another, which usually kept them in marginalized position of, I don't know, below 10% of support. Navalny has been able to break out of this liberal ghetto in which Russian liberal Democrats can historically find themselves under Putin regime, and he did it through two absolutely great achievements, thanks to his, I believe, talent and political intuition. The first one he was among the first people to realize the incredible potential of internet and especially YouTube. And he has been able early on to build this media following on YouTube primarily, but on broader social media as well, which essentially make him absolutely competitive eventually to even Russia's federal TV channel. The internet, of course, penetrates broader groups of the Russian society and generally represents a challenge to the Kremlin authority. But Navalny was one of the first people to realize that, and one of the first people to fill in, particularly thanks to his anti-corruption video investigations. As a result, he certainly is at this point challenging the monopoly of the Kremlin on the media, historically achieved through control over federal TV channels. And of course, for example, as we know, there was absolutely incredible number of views of his last video about Putin's balance that actually reached millions and millions and millions of views. That's the first one. The second is, of course, the network of regional offices, a de facto grassroots party that he also has built in recent years across Russia. As I said before, in the past, Russian liberal politicians tend to again stay within the very tiny, limited community of the followers, usually limited to Russia's capitals, Moscow and to some extent St. Petersburg. And again, Navalny's biggest achievement over the last years, especially after 2012, was the ability to break through, to again penetrate to the broader groups of the Russian society, build mass following in the regions, and as a result, for example, to get the capacity to mobilize the regional population. We just saw in late January a series of protests in the regions can potentially be classified as the largest regional protest over the last 30 years, as a matter of fact, pretty much the largest after the 1990s protests. People have estimated about up to 300,000 participants who took part in those protests, and those are very strong. The size of those protests is very strongly correlated to the presence of Navalny's offices on the regions. So those two unquestionable achievements that go way beyond Navalny's, own support. It actually speaks to his ability to really, as Brian has said, build the civil society in the country. His own personal popularity on that note has grown in 7 years from 6 to 20%. The approval, here I'm citing the Levada's September 2020 approval rating, where up to 20% of Russians say that they approve Alexei Navalny's activity, professional activity, mostly, of course, his anti-corruption campaign, but also his political actions, which is, again, incredible. And on the political poll, when people are asked to name a politician they trust, Navalny's rating as of now has reached about 5% as of January 2021. That is exactly as much as Gennady Zyuganov, the irreplaceable leader of Communist Party, gets. But that, again, without having any access to federal TV channel, or in the last months only getting absolutely negative coverage on Russia's federal TV channel. Again, that's absolutely incredible by Russian standards, knowing how hard it is to break through for political challenges. And of course, I mean, no one can avoid this question of Navalny's nationalism, as Brian already touched upon. Of course, especially given unfortunate, I believe, the decision by the Amnesty International to revoke his prisoner of consciousness status in the last month. So I agree with Brian that essentially with what Brian said, but I will just add that first of all, Navalny held perhaps some questionable views. It might also be interpreted as part of his political strategy to reach out to nationals in Russia back in 2000s. But whatever it was, he apologized for some things he said, and he has not said anything that may be constructed as nationals in the last 7 years, as per Masha Gessen's recent New Yorker article. So in this sense, I think people should be allowed to make mistakes, especially when they apologize for them repeatedly. Second of all, the anti-Navalny campaign, the campaign that means to discredit him, honestly seems to be at least somewhat linked to the Kremlin's activity in the West. For example, Katya Kazbek, the woman who essentially exposed his old videos that led to an Amnesty's decision, is has ties to RT, Russia Today, and she was a columnist for RT. among other things. So in this sense, it's hardly, we need to understand where the sources of his campaign are coming from, and that essentially we are being manipulated by the Kremlin at this point. And ultimately, as one commentator wrote in chat, it's also important to keep in mind that in Eastern Europe, the nationals has a little bit of a different legacy, and many of the late 1980s liberation movements in Eastern Europe were driven under also national slogans, again, as Brian has said, in an effort to build a national civic community in resistance to the oppressive systems imposed on them by communism, by Soviet Union. So from this perspective, I think it's also important to keep in mind that there's a little bit of a different legacy when it comes to civic nationalism in the context of Eastern Europe, and Navalny's movement he's trying to build essentially relies on the legacy of the Eastern European liberalizing movements in late 1980s.
Well, thank you, Maria. Brian and Maria, thank you for your remarks. I feel we need to address a question that's actually quite sensitive in Russia, which is that there is a current of opinion that in fact Navalny is ultimately controlled by the regime, and that he has to some extent been created as an opposition figure to create the impression for Russians and for the outside world of active oppositional activity, and that his videos, his appearances, have the effect of channeling the Russian protest movement into an ultimately ineffective, in an ultimately ineffective direction. We know, of course, about the videos that RT-linked people have supplied to Amnesty, but I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about people who were formerly connected with Boris Nemtsov, those who were opposition politicians who don't trust Navalny. Brian and Maria, what are your takes on this?
If I may, I mean, this is not a binary question, first of all. If Navalny was created and controlled, he's certainly gone rogue by this point. I don't rule out, and there are a couple working hypotheses out there about this, that Navalny, in fact, in his nationalist period, in the first decade of the 21st century, that he was indeed a Kremlin project. There are a lot of rumors out there that he was a Surkov project, the project of Vladislav Surkov, who was very actively kind of creating this Kremlin-controlled nationalist movement at that time. I don't know this. We don't know this. It's not unknowable, but there isn't any evidence right now to support this. But this hypothesis is out there. I don't rule out that that is how Navalny began. But this is not a binary question. Everybody, to some degree, with few exceptions, has to have some contact with the Kremlin. The hypothesis I think is more likely is that Navalny has support inside the elite. It is not that he is controlled by them or a puppet of them, but that there are those inside the elite, in the quote-unquote liberal wing of the elite. I don't like to call it a liberal wing, but that's what some people call it. It's more of a technocratic wing. But this wing of the elite understands that sooner or later this is going to end. And when this does end, it's a good idea to have somebody on the other side of the ramparts with whom to talk. And I think that hypothesis is I would not dismiss it. Put it that way. Navalny is getting this information that he's putting out there in his very slick YouTube videos and anti-corruption reports. He's getting this from somebody. As a former journalist, I know you don't get information this juicy without having a source on the inside. And David, as a former journalist, you know that too, right? So he is, somebody inside is helping him. But that I would not make the leap from that to saying that he is controlled and created. I would, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and it's a lot less binary than that. So these are the two hypotheses out there. They're not mutually exclusive hypotheses. I don't dismiss either of them. I also don't have evidence to support either of them. I understand that there are many who are suspicious of Navalny. There is a kind of generational change going on in the Russian opposition right now, and there's a stylistic change going on in the Russian opposition right now, and there's going to be inevitable tensions around that. So that's how I would address that. I'd be curious to hear what Maria has to say.
Maria, what's your take on this?
I remember we actually covered this issue several times with Brian as part
Yeah,
of
we've argued about this.
So I'm actually even more skeptical about this than about this concept of Navalny being anyhow Kremlin's agent than Brian is. And I have to say, if you were a double agent, what a thankless, ungrateful job, right? Because first, he's almost left without an eye when he was thrown a brilliant green. His brother was put in jail and spent several years in jail, of course, on completely made-up charges, from which even the European Court for Human Rights has already already said it was a political charge. Next, he's also almost murdered with Novichok, right? We know it happened, as a matter of fact, because Valentine had investigated in a lot of detail, and everyone said all of the credible Western hospitals have and labs have reported it was a poisoning of Novichok. And ultimately, he's also, upon his return, is put in jail for at least 2.5 years, and very likely until the end of Putin's regime. I mean, who would want to, honestly, in that situation, if that was true, if that someone would still believe in after that Putin is that Navalny is somehow a double agent of the Kremlin, what an ungrateful job, shall we say, right? Why would he possibly agree to a job like that, where essentially you are killed or attempted to be killed on a daily basis? So no, I believe the plenty of evidence that exists shows that that is not the case, that he is really just an active political citizen, very brave, who I think, thanks to his courage, to part in a sort of commitment, was able to achieve more than other politicians have been able to achieve in Russia's very hostile political environment, as I said before. And certainly that, however, does not mean, precisely as Brian has said, and I also have that experience, having worked as a columnist at Vedomosti, that yes, people leak information once you reach some kind of following, once you build some kind of influence. People start leaking information to you for whatever reason they have, right? And then it's up to you what you want to do with that information. Do you want to use it? Do you want to check it? Navalny's team probably also received some of the leaked information through different channels, and some of the information helped them build those great investigations that essentially many of us saw on YouTube. But that in no way means that there's any sort of direct connection. That does not in any way present me as Putin's puppet, and as, once again, it would be stupid of him, ridiculously stupid of him, to accept a job that essentially does not deliver anything at all.
David, I would also add one thing very quickly.
Yes, go ahead, Brian.
There are those in Russia that say Navalny's an American agent because he attended the Yale University World Leaders Fellowship. So this cuts many different ways. Playing off of what Maria just said, there are those in the elite that definitely use Navalny to spread compromat on their rivals. There's no question about that. But then this is not being controlled and created in a puppet of the elite. These are entirely different things. So, but yeah, he there's many in Russia who think he's an American agent because he went to Yale. So.
Well,
maybe he's a double agent.
All right. Well, this leads us into yet another question that I want both of you to consider, and that is, Navalny focuses on corruption. Corruption is, anti-corruption campaigners historically are not necessarily Democrats. In fact, we may recall that Boris Yeltsin, I was very glad to hear Brian referring to the experience of Yeltsin coming to power, because Boris Yeltsin came to power in large measure on the strength of his war against privileges. Party privileges. In fact, as soon as he began to enjoy those privileges, he announced that his he had become more blasé about, and that was the word he used, about such privileges than he was when he was, fighting for power. And in fact, the corruption that Yeltsin unleashed dwarfed anything that existed under Gorbachev or under the Communist Party, and it still exists. And in fact, Putin himself vowed to fight against corruption when he came to power. So it's not unusual for someone in opposition to present himself as a fighter against corruption. And it has a certain superficial resonance in Russia, although we know that for all of the videos, for all of the people who have seen those videos, they've had zero effect in changing the situation. No one has been punished as a result of those videos. And in fact, it's not clear that they've really changed the temper of the country in any significant way. The attitude of many Russians is that everyone steals. But in any case, here's my question. If we hold that corruption is not the problem, but rather a symptom of the problem, what is it that Russia really needs? I mean, we've had the murder of Boris Nemtsov, had the shooting down of a civilian airliner, the Malaysian airliner, not to mention the other terrorist acts going back to the very beginning, the bombing of the apartment buildings, the Nordost-Beslan, the assassinations, and so on. I mean, is this emphasis on corruption superficial or misplaced? Is it really something that can change Russia? I'd be interested to hear your views, or the views of each of you on this. Brian, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I mean, anybody that knows my work knows that I kind of put corruption at the center of it. And I put it at the center of it kind of in a conceptual way. Like I said earlier, corruption is not a bug in Russia's system. It's a feature. The whole system is based on corruption and always has been. You can go back to the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, and it's been pretty much the same. I mean, I was heavily influenced by the work of Elena Ledinieva in her great book, Can Russia Modernize, where she describes this concept of sistema, right, which is based on networks of influence and sanctioned kleptocracy, and patron-client relationships, and Potemkin institutions. And we have basically had different versions of this, different iterations of this throughout Russian history, from the Grand Duchy of Muscovy to the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union to the post-Soviet Russian Federation. As the Russians say, the regimes change, but sistema остается, the system endures. And so I actually think this is at the heart of a lot of things. I think this is what drives Russia's revisionist behavior. Because when you have a system based on institutionalized kleptocracy, and that's effectively what you have in Russia, corruption is permitted. You know this, David. You've covered this. Corruption is not only permitted, it's encouraged. I mean, I had a friend in Petersburg whose brother was a police officer, and he was fired for not taking enough bribes. because the bribes had to be kicked upstairs. You were creating an alternative salary structure. There was this whole informal salary structure created by bribes that were taken on the streets. So my friend's brother was this very rare thing in Russia, an honest cop, which meant he wasn't a cop for very long. So corruption is so deeply ingrained, and it leads to revisionist behavior, because when you have a state based on this, transparent democracies on your border are seen as an existential threat. So I really put this at the center of it, and it is one of the reasons I appreciate Navalny so much, because he is putting it at the center of his kind of political activity. I have questions, going back to your earlier question, David, is can this be uprooted? This is the big question I have, because right now I say it's not enough to get rid of Putin. We don't have a Putin problem. We have a Russia problem. We have a Russia problem that's rooted in this concept of sistema, which leads to arbitrary rule and revisionist behavior. And could Navalny change that? And I don't know, because all Russian leaders are to an extent shaped by this system. and they shape it in their own image, right? Sistema under Yeltsin look different than Sistema does under Putin, for example. But would Navalny be able to uproot this octopus of patron-client relationships, informal rules and norms, and sanctioned kleptocracy that just permeates Russia from top to bottom? But I don't think corruption's a symptom. I would disagree with that, David. I think corruption is really at the core of this in a lot of ways. It's why I'm very fond of saying corruption is the new communism, because I think that effectively is what we're dealing with right now, both domestically in Russia as a problem and in the West here as a security threat.
Maria, what's your take on this issue?
I agree with Brian as to the essence of corruption, to the nature of the regime that Putin built. I mean, not to say that there was no corruption in Yeltsin's time. Of course, there was a lot of corruption, but stakes are much, much higher under Putin. Just a reminder that when Michael Kasyanov came to become the prime minister of Russia in early Putin's years, he has a nickname, Mishka 2%, which is how much he would request allegedly for assisting for his assistance in, I don't know, pushing forward certain deals or laws. But 2% is it's a laughable number by today's Russia standards. Today, 60% would look more like it if you're talking to a serious Russian official, right? Not 2%. So it just shows you the scale. And the essence of Putin's regime, I argue in some of my work, is neo-patrimonialism. It's a hierarchical system of redistribution. That is the key factor that allows Putin to sustain loyalty to his regime from primarily the closest elites, Putin's cronies, but also from the broader society as well, because everyone is part of this redistribution of the rent primarily coming from the sale of oil and gas. This neo-patrimonial system is very typical. In some ways, you can think of corruption as being a replacement for ideology. In communist times, ideology what was sustained the loyalty to the system. In today's times, it's taken part of this corruption. And of course, in the long term, the key challenge is that this system creates a lot of stakeholders, right? You want a part of this flow of rent. Otherwise, you're going to be poor, frankly, especially if there's some anti-corruption crusaders come to power. Of course, all of your revenues are threatened. So you're at the same time sort of part of this shady deals that make you very anti-transparency oriented, right? At the same time, this is also your key income, which of course increase tremendously your stakes in the system. This is the nature, this essence of the system is what makes them so resilient. We actually find a lot of regimes like that, typically non-democratic regimes in Africa and post-Soviet space. As a matter of fact, I am currently working on a project about comparison across these two regions with Kirill Rogov, Russia's political scientist. So hopefully in a couple of months, I'll be able to talk more about this topic. Having said that, from a popular viewpoint, corruption is a big problem for the country. So looking at Levada polls, consistently over the last 20 years, corruption is among 4 most serious problems that they name that Russia faces. From this perspective, Navalny's choice, to build his anti-corruption foundation primarily around this topic makes a lot of sense, because it seems that it is perceived by Russians as one of the key serious challenges. In recent years, because of the worsening economic situation, the growth of prices, poverty has actually slightly overcome the importance of corruption, but corruption remains quite a salient issue for majority of the Russian population. And I think that the effort of Navalny's team to target this problem actually delivers. The recent example of this Putin video, which was one of the most watched videos online, Putin's palace, is one of the examples. By Levada polls, 26% of Russian adults watched the video. So the degree of interest in the video per se, right, that shows that Putin actually live in this luxurious, obnoxiously luxurious lifestyle with a horrible taste also, especially in the situation when people are getting poorer day by day, certainly kind of, hits on the nerve. As a result, 17% of Russians who have reported, having watched this video, have said that their attitude towards Putin has decreased, has worsened. So you can see that this is working, especially in the situation when the economy is not doing well. People, and as in Yeltsin, as David, you said, precisely as in early Yeltsin's years, essentially tapping into this resentment, it actually seems to deliver. Of course, these people who said their attitudes toward Putin have declined as after having watched this video are primarily people who are not Putin supporters. But certainly in the long term, especially if more of such investigations come out in the situation when Russia's economy keeps worsening, this will certainly, this has the potential of essentially to increase social resentment in the country, and we see that the polls also suggest that. And ultimately, when it comes to pessimism about fighting corruption, I mean, I wish we were in the situation where we can talk about really seriously, is the new democratic leadership of Russia able to tackle corruption? I wish we were right now in that situation. Unfortunately, we're very far away from that point. But at the same time, post-Soviet countries also give us some examples of extremely successful fight against corruption. And I'm talking about Georgia primarily, of course. Georgia, just a reminder, was considered to be the most corrupt Soviet republic in the Soviet times. And yet, it's also the country that managed to implement some of the most successful anti-corruption reforms and restructure some of the most corrupt bureaucracies, such as, for example, notorious traffic police. Right? So we have those examples, and I think that democratic leadership in Russia, should it ever come to power, will have a lot of experience and successful examples to build upon. So I wouldn't be that pessimistic in the long term.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I would like to. I'd like to comment myself a little bit on Brian's remark about the system. The regimes change, the system remains. Well, what is the system exactly? Is it corruption or is it lawlessness? Is it the fact that, corruption doesn't appear out of nowhere? Corruption is controlled by a state based on law. So if we have a movement against corruption, which doesn't address the underlying lawlessness, in a society in which you have a regime that employs terror, assassination, acts of terror against population, acts of terror against foreign airliners, the murder of Boris Nemtsov, who was the only other person who could call people out into the street, has not been adequately investigated. The official version, it has been, I think, convincingly discredited by independent investigators and by a conclusion of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, by the way. These issues are not, these underlying moral issues, which were exemplified, of course, by Andrei Sakharov and the Soviet dissidents. And in this respect, I agree with Brian completely about the tragedy of Sakharov's death, clearing the field for someone like Yeltsin. But are we in danger, looking at this historically and at a philosophical level, of repeating some of the same mistakes, falling into the same pattern, pursuing not the real problem, but an emanation of the problem, which will not go away unless the real problem is solved. So how do you solve the real problem? I mean, is there any, so this brings me to this question for both of you, Brian and Maria. Do you see anything in Navalny's record that suggests that he is sensitive to or willing to take on these fundamental moral issues? Let's take the murder of Boris Nemtsov, for example, a fellow dissident, someone whom he knew well. I have not seen anything from Navalny to hold accountable, Putin and his entourage for that murder, although there's abundant evidence that they were responsible. What's your take on the moral dimension of, and aside from the attack on corruption, but rather his attention to the question of rule of law, finding out the truth about Russia's history, getting to the bottom of the terrorist acts? How do you see that, Brian?
I mean, I think if past is prologue, I'm not terribly optimistic about that. I mean, we have basically, Russia shied away from doing this the last time around in the 90s. And I would probably suspect, although I'd love to be proven wrong, that they are going to do so again for political expediency. But David, back to your the dichotomy you drew between lawlessness and corruption. I mean, I think these two things are handmaidens, right? These two things go hand in hand. And the key issue here, I think, is institutions. Because when I give this lecture talking about these kind of networks of influence and patronage and everything, well, people say, yeah, you got that in Washington too. And yeah, we do. If I walk downtown a couple of miles, I'd be tripping over lobbyists, right? But the difference is that those lobbyists and all those networks that exist here in DC have to operate in a system of law. They have to be subservient to institutions. And the problem in Russia is that all these networks, whether it is a death squad that takes out Nemtsov at the behest of Kadyrov, probably ultimately at the behest of Putin, or if it's a money laundering scheme, it is not subject to any rule of law or any institution. The key variable here is institutions. So I think the lawlessness and the corruption piece go hand in hand. But to answer your question, I sincerely would hope, to have, justice for Boris Nemtsov's family, and for all of the other assassinations, for the apartment bombings of 1999 that you've written so eloquently about, David. In your book, I assigned to my students at the University of Texas, by the way.
I'm glad to hear that, Brian.
Because it's the most clear case that this was indeed a false flag operation. I want to see a reckoning for all this stuff. But hell, we still don't have a reckoning for the Kirov murder. So nothing suggests to me that Navalny was going to go down that road. I would love to be proven wrong, but I just, if past is prologue, I don't hold out much hope on that. This society has not been very good at holding itself accountable and kind of rehashing the past and going through all those necessary procedures. We saw it briefly in the late 80s during Perestroika, with Memorial and the exposing of Stalin's crimes, but it stopped pretty quickly and people got tired of it. Remember the song from the rock band Kino, "Я не люблю, когда меня врут, но правда это juste." I hate it when people lie to me, but I'm also tired of the truth, right? So I think this is going to be something that we're gonna bump into again, unfortunately.
Maria, I'm sorry, Brian. I just wanted, perhaps we can switch to Maria. Maria, what's your take on this?
First of all, as we speak on this, to finish this corruption topic, just today, Russia's beloved State Duma adopted in the first reading a bill allowing Russian officials corruption in emergency cases. So corruption may be legalized if it was emergency, if that was committed due to circumstances beyond the officials' control. See, I would imagine there's a lot of such instances in Russia. This is just another illustration of what we're talking about. David, on your point about Nemtsov and Navalny, to be honest, I have read and heard Navalny quite openly speaking up against these circumstances of Nemtsov death. Right now, actually, I'm reading from his blog that he posted on March 3rd, 2015, a couple of days after Nemtsov was murdered. He openly calls out state-linked organizations, FSB or something similar to FSB security services, who must have been beyond the murder. Essentially, he since the beginning had I think didn't have any questions about that. And just a reminder that Ilya Yashin, Nemtsov's closest friend, who was essentially one of the first people to arrive to the place where Nemtsov was shot, he's actually a very active part of Navalny's team right now. And Navalny also took part in Nemtsov's marches, these memorial marches that take place annually to commemorate Nemtsov's death. When he was not under administrative arrest, because it's very hard to meet Navalny in person, mostly because most of the time when he's in Russia, he's arrested for one reason or another, usually for administrative reasons, but right now, unfortunately, he's staying in jail for much longer. So from this perspective, to be honest, I think he quite openly speak up against the Kremlin. It's true that there was not as many investigations of Putin's own kind of schemes, perhaps because there was just better material against other corrupt officials in Russia, or perhaps Navalny's team maybe also tried not to, openly provoke some serious confrontation until there was some steps taken by the Kremlin. The Kremlin honestly exacerbated significantly the situation when they essentially attempted to murder Navalny. We clearly know that there's direct links linking the poisonings directly to Vladimir Putin at this point, thanks to Bellingcat investigation, among other things, but it's also, honestly, for people who know Russia, was obvious pretty much from the start. And right now, I think they're going to be even more brave. I think Navalny's team will be even braver and even more eloquent in speaking up against the allegations and against Russian officials at the highest level. So honestly, I don't see a lot of problems there. I think that if anything, Navalny has a very clear understanding of the right and wrong in Russia's political system, and he suffered from it, from the realities of Russia's political system firsthand.
Well, thank you, Maria. Well, we're approaching the end of our hour, so I think it's a good time for us to kind of look a bit to the future. And Brian, my question to you is, how do you, what's your prediction for how this situation is going to evolve between now and the presidential elections in 2024? Well, how do you see what I mean, of course, I realize you don't have a crystal ball and so on, but well, what are you expecting?
Yeah, as Yogi Berra once said, I hate to make predictions, especially about the future, but no, I mean, look, we have all kind of played this parlor game of how much trouble is the Putin regime in. We played it back in 2011 after the Bolotnaya protests. We thought they were in deep trouble and back on their heels, and they came roaring back. We played it again in the early days of the Euromaidan in Ukraine, when there was serious synergy between the Russian opposition and the Ukrainians. And then that was shut down by the annexation of Crimea and the burst of fake patriotism that resulted from that. So every time we predict this regime, they're kind of like Freddy Krueger. They just keep coming back. What I see undoubtedly is that we are moving into the period of late Putinism. And by late Putinism, that does not mean that I think the regime is going to fall tomorrow. But what it does mean is that the regime has lost the initiative. The regime is no longer setting the agenda. The regime is no longer justifying its rule by saying we increased Russians' living standards, or we have ended the chaos of the 90s, or we have brought law and order. Their only justification for their rule is they want to keep ruling. And when a regime gets to that point, it is in its late period. So we're in late Putinism. This can go any number of ways. I think the most likely way it goes is in a protracted period of stagnation. So we'll have the second period of Zastoy. It's going to look very much like the late Brezhnev period in a lot of ways. But these regimes always look rock solid to the minute they fall. But we're in the late Putinism period. They don't have any legitimacy. They don't have any initiative. They're not setting the agenda. And their only justification for ruling is that they want to continue ruling. And that's in sharp contrast to the early years of Putin. So that's what I see. I'm curious how this Navalny situation is going to play out. Are they going to basically conclude that keeping him in prison is worth the costs of it. So far, it seems to be that they have reached that conclusion. And then the corollary to that would be, can Navalny's network survive without Navalny? Can it continue? And can it continue to do this work without Navalny? Can the power horizontal be resilient without Navalny? So that's what I would say in terms of predictions about the future.
All right, Brian. Well, with that, I'd like to ask Maria for her take on the future. Maria, where do you think this is all going?
Thank you, David. 100% agree with Brian, particularly about predictions, and political scientists are notoriously bad. So everything I said, I will say is probably most likely not gonna happen based on statistics. But yeah, 100% agree with Brian in the sense that certainly we see the later stages of Putinism. The Crimea effect is gone completely. Looking at the polls, we are back to pre-Crimea levels, that is global levels of approval. There's a lot of challenges to the regime, and the regime has also lost the monopoly on information that it actually used in the past to ensure its popularity. So the new generation has lost completely. The majority of younger Russians actually don't want Putin to stay in power, and over 50% of those groups disapproved of Putin's constitutional amendments that allowed him to stay in power beyond 2024 this summer. So from this perspective, certainly the future is lost for the regime. The problem, of course, is that we all live in the present, and the present can continue for quite a while, especially given everything I said about the nature of neo-patrimonial regimes. They prove to be very resilient, precisely because so many people are part of this corruption and rent-seeking scheme. Too many people have too much to lose, and there's also, of course, the historical Russian desire, unwillingness to change, fear to change, and sort of inertia in some ways. So from this perspective, I agree that it's possible that the situation will last for a while. But 2024 looks increasingly more challenging for the regime, and ultimately the desire, the commitment to kill opponents is not because the regime finds itself in a very safe place, right? So the very fact that, of course, Nemtsov was shot, as we understand now, probably because of the sanctions-related activity, because Vladimir Kara-Murza also reported that the search behind him, he started being followed by FSB-linked security officials precisely at the time when Nemtsov was shot, so those two events may be linked. And most recently, the attempted murder of Alexei Navalny, all are associated to the fact that the regime feels increasingly insecure. But ultimately, there is just so much that opposition leaders can do without the support of the broader population. And the broader population, while increasingly unhappy about what's going on, is also extremely scared and also quite, as I said, inert, unwilling to act. So a lot in the recent years, especially in light of the 2024, a lot will depend on the capacity of Russians to finally wake up, to finally organize, and to finally essentially show that they exist and they don't want the situation to continue.
Thank you, Maria. I think I'm going to have to conclude. I want to just recall conclude with one anecdote or one memory of mine that might be of interest to us, because I remember I was in Paris with my great friend, the late writer Vladimir Vainovich, who's a classic Russian author, and that we had the first signs that something was changing in Russia, that Gorbachev had announced perestroika, glasnost, and I and the French scholar Alain Besançon, we were together with Volodya Vainovich, and Besançon and I were very skeptical that anything was going to change in the Soviet Union. And Vainovich said, no, something has started, and they're not going to be able to continue in the old way. Well, shortly before he died, I talked to Volodya about the situation in Russia, and he said that change was coming, as the regime as it had been ruling would not be able to rule in the future. Now, I mention this because he had an excellent record of predicting historical events. And the few people understood Russia and the Soviet Union as well as Vladimir Ivanovich. So I just throw that in for us to keep in mind about the future. And I want to thank both of you for coming. It's an extremely interesting conversation. And of course, I know you both, and I look forward to seeing you in other contexts. But this it was very great that you agreed to participate in today's event. So thank you very much, and let's look forward to discussing these issues here with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in the future. Thank you.